Ever since the dawn of time, mankind has believed in afterlife. In Finnish folklore, there are plenty of tales of people living, no pun intended, their afterlife pretty much the same way as when they were alive. Dead people, or graveyard people, or rotten noses, as they were called in the old days, had various roles in these tales. With very few exceptions, these dead ones were evil and up to no good. In this story, we find a whole church of them in the old church of Isokyrö. The story takes place in Isokyrö, which is a county in the Ostrobothnia district of western Finland. It used to be the administrative capital parish of the whole Ostrobothnia district in medieval times. And therefore there is a grand old medieval stone church built in 1304. This magnificent church has always been the pride of the county. However, a word of warning. After reading this story, you will look at this church in a very different way. Church of the Dead. Early one Sunday morning in Isokyrö, Elina, a daughter of Tummunki house, woke up in her chamber. With a strange feeling, she rose out of bed and walked to the window. She looked at the nearby church and gasped in surprise. Despite the early hour, there were lights in the church windows. This is strange, she thought. She looked at the wall clock and saw that the Sunday church was not supposed to begin yet. In fact, it was several hours too early for that. I guess the clock must have stopped, Elina said to herself. She began to dress up in a hurry because she was worried about what the neighbors would think of her for being so late. Elina wrapped her black church veil on her shoulder and stepped out. So she started to walk towards the church, which was not very far, fortunately. It was very early April, yet no birds were singing, which was strange. Elina felt as if there was a dark net descended over the whole world that captured all movement and sound that should have been there. The sky was without any color and rose up towards infinity, alien and hostile. Quite soon, Elina opened the familiar door to the church and stepped in, embarrassed by her late arrival. She walked the middle aisle and tried to find a vacant seat for herself. However, the church was packed with people and there were hardly any seats left. Then she noticed that she could not recognize anyone. All these strangers were looking at her, looking puzzled and disapproving. I do not know any of these people, and why do they look at me so sullenly? Surely I am not the first person to be late for church, she thought. Just then she spotted an empty seat. She sat down quickly and started to listen to the sermon, which had just started. Also, the priest was a total stranger. And what strange priest he was. The priest was speaking in a strange language. Elina was sure she had never heard it before. And yet it sounded strangely familiar. La la Cthulhu Fatang, la la Cthulhu Fatang. The words triggered a vision of deep black space and a horrible awareness of some ancient god. that fed on humans both alive and dead. The face of the priest was chalk white and lips were grey and drooling. In astonishment, Elisa saw that the hair of the priest was long and shaggy, descending to the shoulders. The clerical clothes were ragged and clearly eaten by moths. This must be a congregation of some strange sect. But what on earth they are doing here in a regular church? She wondered and drew her church veil more closely around her shoulders. She looked around herself once again, and now she realized that the whole congregation looked like the priest. All the faces were snow white, and skin was hanging on the facial bones, lifeless and loose. The eyes of the people were blood red, and all eyes were fixed on her. The clothes were all ragged and decayed, as if they were centuries old. Both men and women had long hair, all the way to the shoulders. To her horror, Elina saw that they all had long nails, some even longer than their fingers. And the worst thing was the expression on their faces as they stared at her. An expression of anger and resentment mixed with grief. She turned to a girl who was sitting next to her. Excuse me, but what congregation is this? I think I should not be here. The girl nodded her head slowly and said in a weak voice, No, you should not be here. You should leave quickly if you want to save your body and your soul. Elina gasped in astonishment because she recognized the girl. You are Liisa Ojala, my old childhood friend. But you drowned in the river when we were children. Yes, I drowned. And now I belong to the congregation of the dead. We worship a nameless god, older than the earth itself. And quite soon you will be one of us. If you don't act quickly, you may still have a chance. Run for your life. Run for your soul. Run like never before. Run straight to your home. And remember, no matter what you see or hear, don't look back. The dead girl started to shake because the speech had taken all the strength out of her and she collapsed on the floor. Elina looked around and saw that all the dead people were standing up now. And now she started to recognize other vaguely familiar faces, made almost unrecognizable by the long years in the grave. Even these were looking at her in anger and confusion. Some dead ones had clearly been in their graves for several centuries, rotting and decayed, barely human in shape. Their eyes were shining red. A hungry gleam started to glow in their eye sockets. These corpses started to walk toward Elina with shaking steps and reached out with their hands. Some touched her with rotting, maggot-eaten fingers. The stench of grave and death filled Elina's nostrils and she almost fainted. She looked down and saw the miserable corpse of her childhood friend lying on the floor. The corpse looked at her with mournful eyes, and the decomposed lips formed a wordless plea. Run! Elina came to her senses and started to run towards the door. A greedy and rotting hand grabbed her veil, and it dropped to the floor. However, she had no intention of turning back to reach for it. She ran out of the door and sprinted right through the fields towards her home. There were voices behind her. It sounded like a large crowd was chanting something alien, weird, and horrible. La la Cthulhu Fatang. La la Cthulhu Fatang. There were also distinct voices that she could almost recognize. Voices that pleaded her to turn around and join the dead ones in eternal life, free from sorrow and human suffering. But she kept running because she remembered the words of her childhood friend. Don't look back. Elina rushed into her house and ran straight into her chamber. She fell down sobbing on the bed and covered her face in the pillow. She must have fallen asleep because when she lifted her head, there was a ray of bright morning sun in her chamber. She heard voices of her family from the main room of the house, talking and laughing mixed with the sounds of breakfast and chiming of plates and cutlery. What a nightmare it was! It seemed so real, she thought. She joined the others who were getting ready to go to the church. After brief hesitation, she shrugged her shoulders and decided to go along as well. She even smiled to herself and thought, what a silly girl I am, afraid of my own nightmares. The family walked to the church under a clear blue sky as the birds were singing praises of spring. They stepped into the church and Elina saw that there were already some people there, sitting in their usual places. But these people were all familiar and quite ordinary humans, people she knew. But then her gaze fell down on the floor of the middle aisle. She saw something that she could never forget for the rest of her life, however hard she tried. Lying on the floor were the remains of her church veil, torn to shreds.